Hi everyone. So the title of this video may seem a bit ambiguous, but what we're going to be talking about today is how differences in elevation on the map can affect how terrains will be able to generate. So in this video, I'll share some tips, some rules about the way terrain generates with respect to elevation, and also try to provide some useful examples as to how to apply those particular tips. So let's take a look at the map that we have a sample of here. So this is basically just a map that's grass with a big hill in the middle. And now, when it comes to placing terrains, there are explicitly two attributes that are specifically for elevation purposes. So those two attributes are height limits and set flat terrain only. So height limits is a pretty self-explanatory one. So you can choose whichever elevation range to spawn a specific terrain in. So this particular land is with a base elevation of 7. So if I want to spawn elevation only at the top, I can specify the minimum and maximum height to be 7. And I can spawn the dirt just on the top there. And when I say there are explicitly two attributes for controlling the terrain with respect to elevation, that's because this attribute, set flat terrain only, does nothing on its own. So say we had set flat terrain only. See, even though the slopes of this are not flat, it'll still generate there. And that's because this set flat terrain only attribute must be paired with a spacing to other terrain types attribute of at least 1. So if I add that attribute to the terrain generation statement, we can see what happened here. So now it's going to only spawn on the flat terrain, and it'll avoid the elevated tiles. And if I go back and change that to 0, you can see that was the way it was before, where it doesn't avoid the elevation. And I can change that value to be even bigger than 1, so it can avoid those elevated tiles by a certain amount. But then if I get rid of that set flat terrain only, since there are no other terrains to avoid, spacing to other terrain types, there's no other terrains to avoid besides the base terrain, which is grass, we can see that there's nothing else to avoid. And that may seem pretty intuitive, but there's a kind of exception to this rule. So whenever you're spawning water terrains on ground terrains, or vice versa, this spacing to other terrain types can have a slightly different meaning. So you can see that when I'm trying to create water on top of this grass, we can see that even though there are no other terrains besides the base terrain grass, we're still avoiding the elevated tiles of grass by at least 10 tiles. And this is basically the exception. When you're trying to create a water terrain on top of a ground terrain, or a ground terrain on top of a water terrain, then the attribute of spacing to other terrain types will still mean spacing to other terrain types, but it will also mean spacing to an elevated tile of the base terrain. So with all that being said, let's take a look at an example. So basically what this map is we have two separate islands, and the goal of this map is to have one side connected and the other side separated by water. Now, when we are implying that the lands are going to be connected, that usually implies a connection generation section. So for example, like this. So we have create connect all player lands, replace the water with desert, replace the beach with desert, and the fact that our terrain costs are going to be very high for water and medium water, that's going to make it avoid going through the center here and prefer to go along the edges. So if we now test this, we can see that that's exactly what's happening. And we can achieve our objective in connecting one of the flanks while leaving the other one separated. However, this particular method only really works in a 1v1 situation. So if we load up a team game situation, let's try and see what that connection method looks like in a team situation. So when we are looking at this, we can see that we have bigger teams. We can see that it connects, this particular connection method connects all players to all players. So we are now connected on both sides instead of just one, like our objective was. So this whole concept was the basis for the map called Crescent. And if we go into this map, we can see that we have successfully been able to create a connection only on one side, but not on the other. And so we'll take a look at how this is done. So if we go into the real map, Crescent, so we can look what the section looks like. So if we go to connection generation, and we can see that there is no connection generation section in this whole map. So how is this being done? And to figure this out, we are going to start our terrain generation section from scratch. So we're going to comment out all of the terrain generation and bring it back step by step to see everything that's going on. So what we can see is that in the beginning of the map, we just have our base terrain rocks. We have the player lands created as rocks also with a base elevation of 3. And we just have a generic land in the middle, which is desert. So we can see the desert here. We can see the differences between the player lands and the rest of the map by the difference in elevation here. So let's take a look at our first terrain statement, which is creating terrain dirt. So we're trying to create the terrain dirt on the base terrain rocks. We're trying to take up all of the area that is at a specific distance away from the neutral land, which is the desert. So based on the map size, it's going to spawn a particular amount of tiles away from that particular desert land. However, we don't want this particular dirt terrain to be spawning on top of the player lands. So in order to distinguish the rest of the map area, so to speak, from the player lands, we're going to use height limits attribute of 0, 0. So since the rest of the map, so to speak, is at height limit 0, and the player lands are at elevation 3, we can generate this. And we can take a look and see somewhere that this particular dirt terrain has been generated at the specified distance away from the middle land, but we can see the place at where the height limits start to come into play, since without those height limits, we'd be kind of incurring onto the player lands, which we were trying to avoid. So that's step 1. And now step 2 is going to be a terrain statement that's very similar to the first. So it's going to be creating desert on top of rocks with a spacing to other terrain types attribute. And if we're going to take a look at this here, we can see that in this case, the terrain that it's going to be avoiding with the spacing to other terrain types attribute is the dirt terrain. Since the middle land that was initially created was desert terrain, this desert terrain that we're creating now isn't going to avoid that. But then also similarly to the first land statement, or the first terrain statement, we have height limits also to ensure that this desert terrain that we're spawning is not going to incur onto the player lands, which are elevated. And so the step after that is to replace the dirt terrain that's on the outside of the map with desert. So now let's recap what we've done here. So now let's notice here that we have now only two particular strips of rock terrain that are at elevation 0. We have the strip on this side, and we have the strip on this side. Every other area which is covered in rock terrain is at a greater elevation than 0. So now we're going to get to the part where we only want one connection between the islands. So we're creating dirt on top of rocks, height limits 0. And notably, we're not going to define the number of groups because we only want one. And if we take a look at that, what this did, since we have one strip of rock terrain at elevation 0, and now we have one strip of dirt terrain that was replaced at elevation 0 also. So at this point, we've basically achieved the objective we set out to do. So we have one connection between the players is a different terrain type than the other connection between the players. So the rest of the terrain generation section is not going to be very complicated. So we're just going to use desert to replace the dirt terrain. So we have basically a seamless connection between the inside part of the map, the outside part of the map, between this connection here. And then we're going to change our player lands into a buildable terrain, which is grass. You can see that there. And then we can create some forest for the players, like that. This is essentially supposed to be a water map. So we have now created our water here. We still have this particular patch of rocks that's connecting the players, and we want to replace that with desert now. So now there's a desert connection. And then the remaining items here are just purely for aesthetic purposes. So it's just creating a few palm trees on the desert, like that. It's creating some grass 3 on the grass for a bit of terrain variety, and then some medium water on top of the water to give some variety on the water there. So that was basically the example of how we can use elevation on the map to our advantage with the intention of placing terrains in a specific way. And this method, of course, is conditional on the fact that the player lands are at a different elevation compared to the rest of the map. Because if we were running into a situation where if we didn't want the player lands to be elevated, then this method would kind of fall apart because there would be no elevation difference to distinguish anything that's supposed to be spawning. So the elevation difference is necessary. Okay, so the next map that we are going to be taking a look at here is this one, which is called Terrace. So the way this map looks is that the elevation on the map is very gradual. See, there's a bit of space in between each of the steps of elevation on the map. And between each step of elevation is a strip of unbuildable rock terrain on the slopes. And then on the flat portions of the map is going to be the buildable terrain, the ground, where all the forests and other resources on the map will be able to spawn. And so if we go into the test map, which is supposed to be constructing this, we can see how this is set up. So the base terrain of the map is rocks, and the player lands are separate from the base terrain by this particular ground terrain, and that's what we're seeing here. So player lands are ground, and the rocks are elevated, elevation 7, with a spacing of 8, which is enabling us to have a very gradual rise in elevation instead of steeper slopes. And so when we're looking at the terrain generation section of the map, we can see that this is a good example of where we could use the attribute set flat terrain only, since we want all of the buildable terrain to be on the flat portions and all of the rocky portions to be on the slopes of the elevation. So when we're using set flat terrain only, we of course need to have the spacing to other terrain types attribute of at least 1. And we can see that that is necessary because if we change that from 1 to 0, we can see that instead of having the ground spawn on the flat terrain, it'll spawn instead everywhere, leaving no space on the slopes for rock terrain. So that's what we're trying to avoid. But then also notice that there is quite a difference between having a difference between a 0 and a 1 value for this spacing to other terrain types. Because if we take a look at this now, we can see that there are actually, let's see, actually 1, 2, 3, a 3 tile width for this between this grass patch and this grass patch, instead of the 1 tile width which we were hoping to achieve. So there's no real middle ground for generating terrain with this method, which is annoying, but that's kind of the way it works. So what we're going to do to overcome this particular issue is, instead of having the base terrain of the map be rocks, we'll have it as a different terrain. So it's going to be patch 2, and we're going to see what that looks like in a second. So we're going to elevate the patch 2, and then we're going to have the ground be spawning on the patch 2. And so this patch 2 is now road terrain instead of rocks. And now we can have another terrain generation statement that's creating rocks on top of the patch 2 with the spacing attribute of 1. So it's going to stay away from that grass. And if we take a look at what this does here, we can see that there is a 1 tile width of road terrain on the top of the hill, a 1 tile width of road terrain on the bottom of the hill, and so we're left with only 1 tile width of rock terrain in between those, which is what we were trying to achieve. So now that that 1 tile width has been created, we can then replace this road terrain at the top and bottom with our buildable ground terrain, and that's exactly what this terrain statement is doing. So you can see for the most part it did just that. Since there are very many sections of terrain, it can sometimes leave stuff out. So sometimes it helps to copy and paste these statements a couple times so we can see that it's more effective at replacing those individual patches. But that's how it works, and if we uncomment the rest of the script, we can see what that does. So nice looking map, and that's how we can use flat terrain attributes to generate a map such as this. So the next example I wanted to take a look at was the map Pond Arena. So this is a pretty old map. The first version came out in 2014, and the way it was scripted was basically let's take a look at this here. So basically it started out as creating a land terrain as the base terrain, creating the pond in the middle, and then the forest terrain was created as a terrain statement instead of in the land generation section, which is supposed to avoid the lake in the middle by a particular spacing based on the map size. So as the map size increased, the available space between the pond and the forest would also increase. And so this is very closely representing the first version of the map. And the main problem with this is that the variation in spawn positions for players can sometimes have a really negative effect on the map. Since if we take a look at this player, for example, he has almost no space in the back of his base, since he happen to spawn very far away from the edge. And now, when we're talking about this whole variance in player starting location, you gotta understand that this map was made before things like direct placement and circle placement became a thing. So if the map was random placement, that's kind of all we had to deal with. So at first, this was kind of the limitation that we had to live with, because there was no real way to distinguish the player's land from the rest of the map. Since the way this map was created, we'll get rid of the terrains. If the player lands happen to be a different terrain than the base terrain, we can see what that looks like here, and we can see that all the players now have a certain amount of area to their base. But the problem with that is that as soon as we start creating the woods, now instead of only avoiding the water, we have this other terrain that needs to be avoided, and so this kind of falls apart also. There's no space available to create those the trees, because it also has to stay how many tiles away? 47 tiles away from the player bases, as well as 47 tiles away from the water here. So this is why it was first created with that ground terrain. However, the terrain type of a particular land is not the only thing that we can use to distinguish the player lands from the rest of the map. So if we were to give the player lands a certain base elevation, of 1, we can generate this map, and we can see that now we can distinguish between the player lands and the rest of the map without distinguishing between the terrain type. So now if we change this set avoid player start areas to height limits of 0, 0, since now the player lands are elevation 1 instead of elevation 0, now we can see that we're starting to see a bit more of a defined base that's cutting out of the trees. And we can reduce these borders to have a more pronounced effect. So now you can see that this player's base is cutting more into the woods, and he's getting more area available to him, which would otherwise be restricted in the first version. So this is another good example of how we can use differences in elevation to affect how terrains are going to spawn on our maps. So before we get into another example, I wanted to talk about something that's pretty generic. So say we have this particular land here, and we want to put a hill on it. So there are basically 2 ways that we can approach this. So the first is to create an elevation generation section, and then create elevation. Let's call it 7. Base terrain. Tiles. Yeah, we'll just call it that for now. And so we have created a hill on the land. And what we can notice here is that the way this method works is that the land gets created first and the terrain gets created after, such that the slopes of the particular hill are going to be encompassed in the terrain that we generated on. Now the other way of generating lands, we'll get rid of this, of generating hills, sorry, is base elevation. And so if we do something similar, give that a base elevation of 7, we can see that this generated slightly differently. So the land is created at that particular elevation such that the slopes of the particular hill are now the base terrain instead of the elevated terrain. So that's one thing to keep in mind, and we can use this to our advantage when we're scripting maps. So I wanted to take a minute to look at this map, which is Canyons. And this is not a random map, it is a special map. And this is due to the fact that a large component of this map is the fact that it is very precisely placing cliffs, a lot more precisely than could ever be achieved using a random map. I mean, with a random map, you could play around with your land generation to affect where cliffs would be able to spawn, but there's no attribute in a random map script that can influence which direction the cliff will be facing, and that can have implications. So, what I'm going to show next is going to be a sort of way to mimic a cliff using the differences in elevation. So we're back in the editor here with a random map, and let's take a look at the code for this map. So right now we have the player lands created as a grass terrain with a base elevation of 7. And now we have generic lands in the middle of the map, which are dirt 2. And if we look at what this is doing, so we can see that player lands are of course elevated, but since we're using base elevation instead of creating the land and then creating the elevation after, we can see that we now can affect the slopes of that particular land, the player lands, based on those generic lands that we've created. So right now, the slopes of the player lands are going to be this dirt 2 terrain until we get to the edge of the borders specified by those generic lands. So the next step is to create elevation 7 on the remaining grass. And since now we are creating the elevation after the land has been generated, we can see what happens now is the fact that now the slope of this particular hill is not going to be covered in this dirt 2. It's going to be separate. So now if we take a look at this, we can notice that at the end of every hill elevation change is this place where the grass will remain unaffected by this dirt 2. We can see that here and here and all the way around. And so now with this, we can now go into the terrain generation section and effectively generate a beach terrain that is at height limits 0 to 5. So considering that we have elevation as high as 7, creating this beach terrain between elevations 0 and 5 is going to leave only elevation 6 left over for the dirt 2. And if we look closely, we can see that there's a small strip of dirt 2 that's between the beach terrain and the grass terrain, which is only at elevation 6. And we can uncomment the rest of the map here to show what we can do with that. So basically what we can do is we can place these many individual rock objects on top of that dirt 2, which is only at elevation 6, to create a pseudo cliff, so to speak, because it's both impassable and it also provides a hill bonus when attacking downhill. And we can notice that based on the way we generated that outside elevation, that there will always be an opening into the middle that isn't going to be obstructed by rocks. We have an opening there, and there, and there, and similarly everywhere around the map we have an opening that isn't obstructed by rocks. And so this is something that would never be possible to achieve if we were trying to use cliffs. So the way this is set up now, we would prefer to have the hill bonus going from the player lands down into the middle, where the middle would be at the disadvantage, in which case the cliff direction would look like this. But since we can never control the direction of the cliff in a random map, even if we were to be able to be this precise in placing the cliffs, we could still run into a situation on this side where the middle would be at the advantage and the player land would be at the low ground. So this is just another one of those situations in which knowing how elevation changes are going to behave can affect the way we can create terrains and therefore objects such as these. And I realize that some of these examples may seem a little niche in the sense that they may not be the most applicable to generic maps, but all these little tidbits of knowledge can add up to have quite a bit of a significant impact on your overall scripting aptitude. And hopefully that can also give you some tools which would enable you to think outside of the box from time to time. And I think that's about all I wanted to go over in this video. So as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you've learned something.